Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 87 and I am the show's host Kyle. In today's show I'm going to be talking about the downward spiral in American relationships with other countries and just kind of our situation around the world and how interventionism have got us there. I'm actually pulling this phrase from a pretty recent news story where the United States told Russia to close down 2 offices and 1 consulate in the United States, and then they said the Russian and U.S. relationship is on a downward spiral. I'm guessing that the observation was made this way because of the way, the Russian and U.S. relationship has gone from, war games leads to sanctions on one another, leads to kicking out different personnel, leads to closing consulates and taking property. Of course, all this kind of stuff only adds to the problems that we face, and so I'm going to do this and go over a few other countries other than just Russia because I think this is a constant trend in American foreign policy, at least really dating back to the end of the Cold War. So looking at Russia, some of the new stuff we have going on is the U.S. is sending a bunch of F-15s to the Baltic states. This is because Russia is preparing to start some war games with Belarus. These war games will involve, I believe, 12,700 troops and no more. There were some reporting I saw 60,000, 100,000, 30,000. It looks like it's going to be under 13,000. And so as the media kind of hots it up for the state and makes everybody scared of these big bad Russian war games to come, they're really not that big. They only occur every 4 years. The United States, on the other hand, carries out huge war games with NATO seemingly every year and certainly carrying out large war games all over the globe pretty much 24/7 now. The UK, of course, part of the NATO alliance with the United States, is sending some warplanes to the Baltic states as well. This is apparently because they're going to up, surveillance missions and stuff on the borders while all this is going on. Times like this seem to be dangerous, not necessarily because anything dangerous needs to happen, but because you have all these warplanes flying close to each other, you'll have so many troops in this area, and any little spark could set off a huge international incident. And so it seems from America's point of view, it's kind of a waste. We're sending more planes, we're going to be spending more money. It's expensive to fly these planes around. It's not like these missions are free. They require fuel, pilots, maintenance on the airplanes, and all this other stuff goes into it. But it's just a larger picture of what happens where everything in the United States and Russian relationship is going in the wrong direction. If you look at it, we have more troops on the border with Russia. Of course, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania are all right near the border with Russia, and Poland also has a border with Russia's enclave, and we have all these NATO troops on those borders. And so if you look at it, just and the last 4 years of the Obama administration, we really went the wrong way with our relationship with Russia. Both sides seem to acknowledge this, but neither side seems to be able to just carry out the right move, which would be invite the other country over for dinner and, see what kind of work could be done. It seems like the only real thing good that's happened between Russia and the United States since Hillary Clinton, taint the Russian reset in Obama's first term is Trump and Putin's meeting where they were able to create a meaningful ceasefire in a small area of Syria, which, up until that point hadn't been done. And so I think there's a lot to say for diplomacy between the two nations, but right now it seems that the waters are so tainted a lot of ways by the American media and the Democratic Party and the Republican GOP. And I'm sure Putin faces nationalistic pressures from Russia that tell him not to associate with America and all this other stuff as well. But it's going to require somebody on one of these sides and, somebody on both sides really to set up a meeting and talk this out, and so we don't end up at nuclear war with each other. And I think that's like the most important point to remember, is that all these planes flying around each other near the Baltics could lead to a nuclear war, and is that really worth it? Man, it is hard to imagine that would be. The relationship with North Korea and the downward spiral there. So we have Trump talking, saying that talking is not the answer with North Korea, and that the U.S. has been paying North Korea extortion money for many years. Now, the extortion money comment, I think what he's referring to is the United States has provided aid to North Korea in the past and has allowed China to provide aid to North Korea. under the agreed framework, the United States was supposed to provide North Korea with some, I believe, oil or coal subsidies in order to offset them giving up their nuclear energy program, which would make sense, right? North Korea doesn't have a whole lot of natural energy there, so they need to produce energy. Nuclear energy would be one of the best ways for them to produce it, but because they were in the agreed framework on that time, they weren't able to produce the nuclear energy, so they had to rely on, extra imports coming in. I'm not sure what else Trump will be referring to when he talks about extortion payments. But just looking at, I think the best example of the downward spiral is really in the relationship with North Korea, where it seems like both sides are just making this worse and making their position more and more likely to lead to military intervention. It all really got kicked off right in the beginning of Trump's administration, where we had Kim Jong-un apparently having his half-brother killed by some sort of neurotoxin, I believe in Malaysia or another country in that area. Because of this, the United States cancels planned peace talks with the North Koreans, and since then, they've never been able to get along. I think from Trump's perspective, he was just kept hearing how bad North Korea is, and that assassination of Kim Jong-un's brother was really, I think, a pivotal moment in Trump getting him to believe that. Since then, it's been a cause of war games being met by North Korean threats, being met by United States shows of force, and then North Korea will conduct a weapons test, and the United States will, conduct its own weapons test as a show of force, and this basically has gone back and forth to the point now where we have North Korea launching missiles over Japan. And so things have really gone, I think, further than anybody wanted them to go. I don't think the United States or North Korea wants to be in a situation where both countries had their fingers on their buttons and trying to decide if it's worth it or not to start a nuclear war. And hopefully, they'll always evaluate it the way we will want it evaluated. But it seems like the positions of the two leaders are getting further and further apart. Of course, this has all overshadowed the president of South Korea really trying to have some kind of peace or some kind of lasting agreement with the North Koreans, and he doesn't want this war, but it looks like the United States and other countries are pushing more towards it. And in both cases, with Putin and with Kim Jong-un, they both share definitely some of the blame for what's going on. The United States is the world's superpower, and so I think for that reason they take a lot of blame, as they should, and a lot of this is American aggression that's causing all of this blowback from other countries. But at the same time, Kim Jong-un cannot fire missiles over Japan and risk, starting a war that way. I mean, imagine if the missile malfunctions and unfortunately crashes on a piece of Japanese land and kills some Japanese civilians, then you are asking yourself, then what? And Kim Jong-un and North Korea really took that risk. In Syria, the United States is in a mess, and it seems that even the neoconservatives can't even logic their way out of it. The United States has created a situation in Syria with our arming of jihadist groups and the empowerment of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, to where anytime we're fighting against those groups, we're kind of de facto helping Iran and the Syrians. This is, of course, greatly upset our ally in Israel. Israel has even threatened Russia, telling them that if Iran gains any more ground in Syria, then they're going to conduct a strike on the Assad presidential palace. And so we've gone from a situation in Syria where, at least under Assad, there was some stability. And then because of our arming of the rebel groups and the empowerment of Al-Qaeda and ISIS through the CIA program of giving rebel groups weapons, Al-Qaeda and ISIS became a force that was able to take a lot of ground in that country, and Assad wasn't able to maintain it himself, which led to more Iranian and Hezbollah and Russian influence in the Assad government, as those are the countries trying to help Assad defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so now the United States is left in an impossible position where if we arm and support the YPG in order to be able to take ground and weapons from ISIS, then we're upsetting our NATO ally in the Kurds. If we just conduct airstrikes on ISIS, this only benefits Assad and the Iranians, and so that upsets the Israelis. And it seems Russia has made it clear that any direct war against the Assad government will be a war against Russia in their eyes. And so we can't really take that option either. And so it seems that the simple solution is to just leave. But of course that would upset the Israelis because, then the end result they don't want would come to pass, which is Iran gaining more not territory really, but influence in Syria. And since the start of the Syrian civil war, which I think was seen as an opportunity by the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, and Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israelis, is to make some ground in Israel or in Syria. What ended up happening as the U.S. Special Envoy Brett McGurk said that we now have the largest terrorist safe haven, which is the province of Syria, since before 9/11. I guess he was referring to Afghanistan, allowing the Al-Qaeda guys to hang out in the remote mountains there. And so not only has this been a disaster as far as U.S. policy goes, but it's even worse for the civilians who had just seen their quality of life deteriorate and crumble under a 6-year civil war. Even the liberation of ISIS, which should be a positive thing, the U.S. is right now killing so many civilians in Raqqa that the UN is saying, hey, you got to cut this out. And the U.S. is saying, no, we're going to keep bombing the way they are. As I pointed out in previous episodes, the U.S. has dropped more bombs in Raqqa than suspected ISIS fighters in the city, and so a lot of these bombs have to be hitting civilian targets because they're obviously not hitting ISIS, because had they been hitting ISIS, all the ISIS fighters would be dead. And so we also have a problem that the U.S. is killing anybody who tries to flee Raqqa in order to keep all the terrorists in the city. I read reports that almost all the foreign fighters have left, so they're all native ISIS fighters that are currently left in Raqqa, so you really can't tell the difference or identify them as being foreign or not native to the region, which means that the U.S.'s plan to trap ISIS in Raqqa means that they just had to destroy the city, and I guess everyone in it until they're positive that anyone left is an Al-Qaeda fighter. Who knows how many civilians that could mean killing, but I'm sure it's well up in the thousands already. 500 or more have died. The U.S. has also found itself in the awkward position where it's preventing ISIS from surrendering to Lebanese and Hezbollah soldiers in Syria. There was a small ISIS enclave on the Lebanese and Syrian border that has slowly been defeated from one side by the Lebanese army and from the other side by parts of the Assad army and Hezbollah. Finally, ISIS was surrounded and surrendered. In total, there were about 600 fighters and members of their families, with the plan to relocate them to a different area of Syria. I'm assuming the Idlib province. For whatever reason, the terms of this surrender were not good enough for America, and they actually bombed the road in front of the ISIS convoy going to surrender, so you kind of wonder what's going to happen now. Maybe we end up seeing a lot of these civilians getting killed that are just the family members of ISIS, or possibly ISIS going on to fight longer in this area and killing more Lebanese or Hezbollah soldiers fighting against ISIS. And we also have ISIS fighters dressing as either YPG or SDF soldiers and setting up checkpoints around Raqqa to try to kill any escaping civilians. And so the civilians in Raqqa, I mean, they're just so lost. You have ISIS posing as SDF. You have the U.S. saying they're going to bomb anyone that tries to leave, especially anyone trying to cross the Euphrates River. And so how do you even get out? Do you just shelter in place and hope that the next bomb to fall isn't the one falling on your house? I mean, the downward spiral of Iraq has been very obvious from at least a controlled Saddam government in 2001, 2002 that prevented terrorism, to 2004 where you have an invasion of Mosul, Tikrit, Ramadi, and Fallujah, and ISIS controlling a large portion of the Iraqi state. Of course, right now we have the Kurds teetering on doing an independence vote or not at the end of September. That date's fast approaching. It does look like if they hold the vote, they will vote for independence. It's going to put the United States in a very awkward position because the United States has really been empowering and helping the Kurdish fighters against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And I think to the Kurds, it will come off as a stab in the back if the United States decides to take the side of the Iraqi government, wanting Iraq to remain as one whole state. However, the United States is trying to continue to have influence in Iraq, which unfortunately for the United States, Iran has gained a larger foothold in there, largely because of the United States war against Saddam Hussein, where they removed this Sunni minority government and imposed a Shia majority government, then increasing ties with the Shiite Iran. Even though ISIS has lost a lot of territory, there's still thousands of people dying every month from war and violence in Iraq. We had 2,154 people at least being killed in Iraq in August. That's not quite half of what the June total was, but was way down our July total, because the July total included the battle for Mosul and the large portion of just the widespread bombing in that city. 333 of the dead were civilians, and the toll inflicted on the civilians just continues to rack up in Iraq. In Libya, we continue to have civilians fleeing the death, chaos, rape, and slave state they have there. Now, this was a U.S. interventionism, of course, in about 2011 under Obama and Hillary. We go in, we bomb Gaddafi out of power. Gaddafi gets sodomized to death by some Al-Qaeda fighters we were supporting with our bombs. And this leads to a state now that's fractured with warring governments, ISIS holding territory, slave trade going on, women being raped everywhere, and just the downward spiral that Libya's caused. Now there's, hundreds of thousands of migrants trying to flee across the Mediterranean Sea into Europe from Africa. And this was never an issue before because, the destabilization in Libya allowed it to happen. In Afghanistan, the recent news is we have deception on troop levels. For the longest time, the official troop level in Iraq has been 8,400. It turns out the number is about 11,000 now, according to the Pentagon. That number is apparently the number that has been in place for about the last 6 months, them calling the troops that really weren't counted before as temporary troops, although they've been there for 6 months. General Mattis had said that the United States was going to try to be more straightforward with our troop numbers, but now it sounds like they're going to be very vague as far as announcing the numbers for the Trump surge goes. We have 2 occasions of NATO killing civilians and hitting small number of militant targets. There were apparently 2 either ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Taliban fighters in these locations with several civilians. In one case, 11 civilians were killed, and the other 16 civilians were killed. And the way you win a counterinsurgency isn't killing 10 to 15 to 1 civilians over the amount of, militants you're killing. That's only going to put you backwards in that sense. ISIS is claiming responsibility for an attack on a politician's home. The politician wasn't killed, but a couple security guards at his home were killed. And so the downward spiral in Afghanistan, I'm very clear to see since 2001, the removal of the Taliban government. The state's been in constant war, even with 150,000 Western troops. They weren't able to control Afghanistan. And so now we're in a situation where after $1 trillion or more and 2,200 American lives, we're doubling down on Afghanistan. We're going to waste more, of our empire there. Some news stories on Yemen. We have apparently the Saleh government and the Houthis making up. Nasser Arabi appeared on the Scott Horton show and talked about what happened. Apparently the conflict all stemmed from some kind of brawl at a checkpoint where maybe a few people were killed after, some people acting like tough guys got into a fight. The Saleh government and the Houthis were able to talk and pretty quickly put to rest any tensions or problems between the two groups. Nasser said they were closer than ever, actually, because they renewed some kind of pact that they had not to attack each other. Nasser Arabi also talked about just a few other Saudi airstrikes in the region where they hit maybe one checkpoint and then hit a nearby hotel, killing up to 60 people, many of them civilians and students. And so it's just a real shame of what's going on into Yemen. And talk about a downward spiral. We've been looking at this situation for 2.5 years and seeing the number of people starving going up, the number of people with cholera going up, warnings about these things saying they don't have the medical infrastructure, that's all being destroyed. They don't have the water infrastructure, it's all being destroyed. And now we're in a catastrophe where Scott Horton recently interviewed the Doctors Without Borders head, doctor or coordinator in Yemen, saying that, absolutely right, 300,000 people have contracted cholera so far in Yemen. A lot of the people are just dying in their homes, and so many people are dying and they don't need to be dying. It's gotten so extreme, we now have 60 human rights groups calling upon an independent investigation into Saudi war crimes in Yemen, because Saudi Arabia is committing an awful lot of war crimes in Yemen. Quick news story on the Iran deal, and that is the IAEA is saying that Iran is meeting all the conditions of the nuclear deal. The IAEA is the group that was set up to enforce the non-proliferation treaty and is also setting up the additional safeguards of Iran's nuclear program in addition to the non-proliferation treaty safeguards. Last story, we have Turkey coming out and complaining about an indictment of 15 of Erdogan's bodyguards. There, of course, was a clash between Erdogan's bodyguards and Kurdish protesters in DC. I believe 19 people in total were indicted, 15 of them being Turkish. Turkey's response was a condemnation in the strongest way of the indictments, and I guess feeling like they did nothing wrong. But if you all check out the video, you could see pretty obviously that the Turkish bodyguards went and beat up a bunch of protesters on the streets of DC for no reason. So that'll wrap up the show for this week. I hope everybody enjoyed the show. Please share the show, Kyle's Files on Facebook or foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. You can find me on Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus, website kylesfilesblog.com, and I'm a blogger at the Libertarian Institute.